Well, good morning. Thank you for your time today. It's a delight to see so many familiar names on the call, as well as many new attendees. For those who don't know me, I am Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we get moving, I want to make sure that you're aware that I have several colleagues on the call today who can answer your questions via the Questions tab, which you should see under or next to the hand-raising icon. So please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, and if those are appropriate for the entire group, they'll also pass them along to me. I also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. And one final note before we just jump right in, you may already be aware, and I hope that you are, but we do have all of our past webinars recorded and available on our YouTube tutorial channel. We'll look at this again at the end of our time here today, but you can access that by going to video.servicetech.com. We have a lot of other shorter tutorials on there as well, but there's a lot of good information there. So with that, let's move into our topic for today, which is how to effectively utilize time slot events. Now, in the past, we've covered service projects and managing hours. We've gone through an overview of the console as a whole, and you can review all those webinars on our YouTube channel, like I just mentioned. But today, we're going to focus primarily on time slot events. So we're going to start off by defining our terms. What are the different types of opportunities available in service? After that, we'll move into kind of some of the unique aspects of creating a time slot event. So some specific or special features or settings that are unique to those. And then lastly, we'll walk through some tips in terms of managing time slots once they're in place, engaging those registrations and sort of some of the other features that you'll find as you're working within time slots themselves. All right, so we're going to start off again by defining the different types of opportunities in service. Now, of course, we're logged in here on the admin side of the system, and under Opportunity Management, when you go to create a new opportunity, you'll see the option at the top of the page here to select the opportunity type. And there are three different options here. We have what we call normal events, time slot events, and service projects. So the differences between these options here: a normal event, or what we call a normal event, is essentially a single shift. So if you look down, there's one start date and time, one end date and time. You're essentially telling volunteers, hey, this is when the event is taking place. This is when you're expecting them to arrive and when you're expecting them to leave. Think of this like a one-off type event, maybe a special event or something that kind of happens infrequently, where you just want everyone signing up essentially for the same thing. So that would be a normal event. We're going to talk about service projects next, and then we'll jump into time slot events. But service projects are basically a way to create long-form opportunities. So if you have any sort of projects that are ongoing, this can range from things like internships or admin assistants or things like that, where volunteers are working with you really consistently. And instead of having them sign up for a bunch of shifts, you just want to have them record their activity. Or it could be something like a mentorship program or a coaching program where you have volunteers operating sort of independently and then reporting back to you those hours. Maybe also you're hiring out some kind of volunteer positions, like you want to have some volunteers do some guerrilla marketing for you or work on some, copy at home and give you that information later. Again, service projects basically afford you the ability to create a long-form opportunity where volunteers can then record activity, or you can record activity on their behalf. But you'll notice here, one of the main differences is there is one start date and one end date, but there's no times associated with this. So again, it's more of like a long-form opportunity as opposed to a normal event where you're actually defining a shift. So time slot events are very similar to normal events. They have similar language there. The concept behind a time slot event is essentially multiple shifts within a single event. So if a normal event is one time slot, you could think of it in those senses. A time slot event allows you to create multiple slots or multiple time slots that a volunteer could select between. So when you're creating a time slot event, and we'll look at more of these features in a moment, you'll notice that they have the same thing, a slot date, a start time, and end time. So you're telling people when the shift itself is taking place. But of course, you can create multiple time slots that volunteers could select between. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual, details and features when you're setting up a time slot, I want to talk about a couple examples that I have set up in my system, that you might be able to relate to. Of course, this is no end-all be-all. There's a lot of different ways to use time slot events, but here's a few examples that I have set up in my console currently. So I have an event in my system called Sort and Repack. This is kind of akin to like a food pantry type event or a food warehouse event where volunteers are going to be sorting and repacking food. So if we go into this particular event, you'll see that this is a time slot event where essentially the same role or same shift is happening 5 days a week. And volunteers can basically just come in and pick what day they'd like to work with us. On the volunteers' perspective, which is what we're looking at right now, they can see the remainder of the current month, so the remainder of August, plus one additional full month. So that's kind of a setting on this particular time slot. I do actually have this time slot event set up on the back end for the entirety of this calendar year. I just have a setting enabled that volunteers can only see the current month plus one additional full month. As soon as we hit September 1st, this time slot event will automatically open up all of the October shifts. So that's one example where basically the same thing is happening day in, day out. In my case, there's basically one template. It's just an afternoon time slot from 1 to 4 p.m. But if I had a morning shift and an afternoon shift, maybe Saturdays are a little bit different, I could contain all of that within one time slot event like this. So another example that I have established in our demo console is called Neighborhood and School Cleanup. And this is more along the lines of like a festival type event. If we look at this one, you can see that there are 5 time slots in here, but all of these are occurring on basically the same date and time. They're all Monday, September 4th, and most of them are 8 to noon. One of them is a little bit longer because it's like a team lead position, but generally speaking, these are all happening concurrently. So this is another example of how to use a time slot event. Maybe you have a bunch of different roles that you want volunteers to select between. Instead of just picking what day they want to come in, you want them to actually tell you what job they'd like to do or where they'd like to be. That's something that can be kind of contained by the time slot itself. Now, I just have labels for these time slots. These are referred to as notes technically. We'll look at that more in a moment. If I needed to expound on, okay, what does the technology team actually mean? That's the kind of data that you would be putting in the description section of the event and just pair that language to each other to make sure people know what you're talking about. But this is another example of a time slot event. Obviously, you can do whatever you'd like to within a time slot event. The idea is you're creating a single event. So you have one event name, one description, one image associated with it. There's one location, which is kind of important. You have an organizer and what categories it's a part of. So it's one event, but there's multiple shifts that volunteers can select between. So let's go back into kind of creating time slot events. There's a few special features associated with them when you're setting up a time slot event that I'd like to point out to you. So if we go to add a new opportunity, switch this over to time slot event, you'll see right away it asks you, well, how many time slots do you want to add? So you can enter a number in here. Using the 2 examples that I just showed you, one of those, I basically just had 5 time slots. And so I wrote that number in, clicked on add slots, and then filled out all the information. That's more of that kind of like festival where there's just like 5 specific roles. In my other example, that sort and repack, which is happening 5 days a week for an entire calendar year, well, technically that's 265 time slots. So I could go in and write in 265 time slots, but that's a tremendous waste of time. There's better ways to create events like that in Service using kind of recurring options or repeating functions. So for that particular time slot, I actually only made one time slot initially because it serves as a template. So in my example, I had one shift, 1 to 4 p.m., 5 days a week. Let's say you have a morning shift and an afternoon shift, or maybe Saturdays are a little bit different too. You effectively just create however many templates you need, and then you can repeat those in a later step. So if I had a morning shift and an afternoon shift, well, then I would create 2 time slots. So I'd go in here and write 2, enter that in, and then each of those time slots has their own date, start time, and end time. So basically I'd be creating the first in the series. Let's say I have a new event happening starting in January, then I would just go in here and pick, well, what's my first date? So I would choose the start date, input my times for that. The number needed is how many volunteers you can take for this time slot. So you want to enter in that number through here. This does need to be greater than 0. If you enter in 0 here, you're telling the system rather that you don't need volunteers for this time slot, so it's not going to display it. That can be useful in certain circumstances. We'll come back to that. But generally speaking, when you're creating your time slots, you want to enter in how many people you need for that particular role. Each time slot also has its own status. You may have seen these options previously. When you create an event in Service, there's an option called Publish Online, which determines whether or not your event gets published for volunteers to engage with. This is what you'll generally use to control whether or not volunteers can see this event and sign up for it on their own. There's, of course, certain circumstances where you don't want to publish an event and you want to invite volunteers to it, and you'd leave this as no. But generally speaking, you'll want to set this to yes open, which is how volunteers would see and register for all of these time slots. And then if you want to control who's allowed to register, you'd use restrictions to do that. But there are other options in here: closed, canceled, coming soon, contact us, and you can use those kind of as intermediary steps as you need to, with certain circumstances. But those same options exist for specific time slots. So maybe you want all of your time slots to be open generally, but this one in particular has been canceled. You can go and modify that for one specific time slot. Obviously, you'd generally be doing that after you've created the event. So in our scenario right now, I'd want this to be open because I'm not assuming that they'll all be canceled. Otherwise, why am I creating it? So that's your status. There's a few other options in there, but generally this will be open, and you might adjust this later. To the right of that, we have how many credit hours this particular event is worth. This does not have to directly align with the actual length of the shift, but typically it will. Right? In my example, I had this happening from 1 to 4 p.m. Let's say it was from 1 p.m. to 4:30. Then I would set my credit hours as being worth 3.5. This is always recorded in hours, not in minutes. And then the notes is how you can add additional information in. In my 2 examples, I showed both the case of using notes and not using notes. In the case where you have the same thing happening over and over again and volunteers are just picking what day they want to come in or what time they're serving, there's often not a need to include notes in there because that just adds information to the page for volunteers to kind of cull through. If all the shifts are the same, I recommend leaving the notes blank. But if you do need to distinguish one shift from another, maybe on this particular day we're working with frozen goods and you want people to know that, you can actually put a label on that time slot to define it. Or in the other example I had where I was defining what roles I wanted volunteers to sign up for, this is where that information went. Okay, so if you are creating like a recurring or repeating time slot event, you basically just build out your templates. If you're making something where you have 15 different positions and all of them are slightly different, then you'd need to build those out by hand. But there are some tools, if we scroll down past the time slots, to do bulk updates. You'll notice next to each time slot, there's a checkbox in here. You can select them manually. You can also say select all or unselect all time slots. And this can be used to drive bulk updates. So maybe all of these are happening on the same date. I could go in and pick that date, click on bulk update, and essentially modify all of them at one time. That can, of course, be very useful if you have a lot of shared information. But you can also do that selectively. So like I mentioned, there's a checkbox here. So maybe I want to only update these last 3 time slots. These are on the 27th. Then I can go and choose those 3, change my date to the 27th, do a bulk update, and now it's only going to modify the ones that I had selected. You can see the other ones remained on the 26th. Okay, so I mentioned earlier there's an option to repeat time slots. We will get to that in a moment. After I've created an event is when I'll see the option to repeat time slots. So what you need to do first, like if we were going to redo that event where I have the same thing happening 5 days a week, I would basically just build out my one template. And then after I've created this template, then I can repeat these time slots, over a given date range. So there's some other information, of course, you have to fill in, like your event name down here, the description of the event. You have to identify who an organizer is. So all the standard information is going to be present as you're building out your event. Couple things that I want to point out that are unique to time slot events. So if we go under the advanced options section, you have the ability in here to allow multiple time slot registrations. Of course, this is unique to time slot events. This is set to yes by default. What that means is that a volunteer can sign up for as many shifts as they would like to. So in the case of something like a food pantry event or something that's just recurring, you definitely want that set to yes. But in the case of my other event where they're all happening at the same time, that festival type event, they're all concurrent, I don't really want a volunteer signing up for more than one of those shifts because they're all happening at the same time. So I have that one set to no. That means volunteers can only choose one time slot in this time slot event. There's a third option in here to require all. This is generally used for things like a series of events. Maybe you have a training series happening over the next 3 Wednesdays, and if a volunteer wants to attend it, you're expecting them to attend all 3 of those. Well, you could set that up as a time slot event, set it as require all, and then when a volunteer registers for that training series, they will be signed up for all 3 of those shifts. So a couple more things that are unique to time slot events. You have an option in here that says require approval of volunteer self-registration. Now this is not unique to time slot events, but there's a setting in here that is. You can see there's an option that says yes, first time only. So what this setting does is it kind of flips the registration process on its head a bit. It makes this more of an application process. Volunteers who are interested in this event get added to a pending list, and then you have to approve them in order for them to actually be registered for that shift. What this setting in particular does, yes, first time only, means that once a volunteer has been registered for one of these time slots, they can sign up for as many other ones as they'd like to. So maybe you only want to vet people the first time they're signing up for this event. After that, they can continue registering as much as they'd like. All right, and then one more setting in here that's unique to time slot events is this automatically hide open slots until. This option, of course, is unique to time slot events. It says show all by default, but you can also select to hide until a certain number of months prior. Now, I was utilizing this for my example. I had it set to 1 month prior. What that means is that volunteers can see the current month plus 1 additional month of time slots. It is a full month. It's not based on the day of the month. So today is the 16th. We see through the end of September, not just through the 16th of September. So it does open up a full month at a time, but this can be really helpful because it allows you to create a large scale time slot event, maybe once a year, and update that once a year. And then your volunteers can only see, a certain forecasted amount. So they don't see the full scale of it. But that happens automatically. You don't have to go and adjust that. As we enter each new month, it'll open up and roll out into the next months. So again, the way I think about this is it's always showing the current month plus whatever number you have selected here. So an example I showed, it was 1 month prior. Maybe you want volunteers to be able to see a couple months ahead. You can choose however many months extra you want volunteers to see. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and create this example that we're building out here. Once you've created a time slot event, obviously I can go in here to manage my new opportunity, but I want to show you from the main dashboard. If we go into search and manage the existing opportunities in our database, in here I can see the new event that I created with a very creative name, event name. And if we go into this time slot event, you'll see there's an option to manage time slots. This is where we can repeat those shifts if we want to create something like a recurring event. So if I click on Manage Time Slots, in this menu, we'll see the option to, of course, update our time slots if we want to make changes to those. This would be where I would cancel something, for instance. But on the left-hand side, I have the option to repeat this time slot. If I go ahead and click on this button, it brings up a dialog that asks you, all right, well, how do you want to repeat this? So I can choose what days of the week to repeat this on. Maybe this particular shift is Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You can choose the frequency. So you can say repeat this weekly or bi-weekly, which would be every other week. You can say repeat this every first, second, third, fourth, or last occurrence of the month. I find this to be really helpful, especially if you're creating like committee or board meetings that happen once a month, maybe the second Tuesday, things like that. You can use that to quickly create those. But let's say this is weekly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Then we choose our start date, which would be whatever we want our first date of this to be. And then the end date would be what we want to go through. So let's say I want to build out actually through May of next year. So just through the end of the school year, we'll select that as our end date. Click on Create Repeating Schedule. If we go ahead and do that, it's going to say, are you sure you want to do this? Because you're about to make a lot of time slots. We'll say OK. And then you can see that it basically just created all of those shifts for us. So now we've built a very large scale event with kind of minimal effort. We just had to make one template and then repeat that out over a larger scale. Now, if I had multiple templates, maybe a morning shift and an afternoon shift, I would take that same repeat action for each of those templates and make them fit into whatever day of the week they made sense on. Maybe Saturdays are different. Again, you use the same tool, you just repeat the specific time slot that you want to. Now, of course, some of these might fall on holidays now. So if we scroll ahead here and look a bit, we might see, oh, okay, actually we're not operating on this day. There's a couple ways to handle that here. You can either delete the time slot, which would remove it entirely. Click on delete here, it'll mark it for deletion. And then when we update the event, it'll remove it. Or you can go in and mark that you need 0 volunteers. So we kind of mentioned this earlier. If you do that, that will disable the time slot. So I'm going to go ahead and update here to save these 2 changes and we'll see what happens. So I'm removing the 25th of December and we're disabling the 22nd of December. So if we go ahead and scroll to the bottom, click on update time slot information, it's going to make those 2 changes that we made. And if we scroll back up to December, you can see now the 25th is gone. That time slot got removed because we marked it for deletion. But the other one is still here on the 22nd. We can see that that time slot still exists, but only on the back end. Volunteers cannot see this. The benefit of doing this is that, now I've disabled this time slot, so, potentially I didn't need volunteers here. Well, maybe we're getting closer to that date and I realize I do actually want volunteers. I can re-enable this just by entering how many volunteers I need and updating the time slot again. So I personally like to disable time slots as opposed to deleting them, just because it gives you more flexibility in re-adding those back in. You can always manually add new time slots into your event, or I could go in here and repeat time slots again. That's fine if I wanted to recreate that date that we deleted. So it's not like I couldn't get that information back. I just find it to be a little bit easier to disable and then potentially re-enable if you need to. All right, so that's creating time slots, using that repeat function to build out large-scale time slot events. There's a couple more things that I want to talk about in terms of engaging with time slot events. So if we go back to the event options dashboard, which is kind of the main menu for this event, we can go in to view the registered volunteers. And on this page, of course, you'll see all of your time slots. Now, since this is an example that I just built out, there's really nothing in here. So we're going to switch gears to a different event. But basically in that page, which you can also access from this menu, you have the ability to view who's registered, and then you can, of course, engage with those registrations. So if we click on this Register Volunteers or Groups button next to a time slot event, it's the same thing for normal events as well, but you'll be able to see, who's registered for those time slots. Now, when you are managing registrations on a time slot event, it will default to displaying today's date forward. So if I wanted to manage my registrations from earlier in the week, I would need to change this display slots available between these dates to whatever that range is that I'm looking for. So maybe I want to look through last Monday or this previous Monday. I can select that as the start date, click on filter, and then that will pull up those dates in here and I can go and review those time slots. So this is the same as managing normal events, except that of course each time slot is broken out into its own section. So I can manage those independently if I want to go and select a particular shift. Maybe this shift has been canceled, or I want to email those people because something happened and I need to talk to them about that shift. I could select that entire time slot and then down at the bottom, go in here and click to send them an email or do different things like that. Couple more notes on this page. These are features that aren't unique to time slot events, but I'd love to make sure that you're aware of them. One of those is impact tracking. So in this particular event, we keep track of a couple different items. We keep track of how many pounds of food were sorted and how many grocery bags were prepared during a shift. You can allow volunteers to record this information themselves when they're signing out from a shift or retroactively just by logging into their account. or you can do that on behalf of the volunteers. And that's actually what we're doing in this case. If we click into, you can see this icon will be black if nothing has been recorded, and it'll turn gold if something has been recorded. So if I click on this icon here, you can see that this information has been recorded. We actually did this on the admin side, and we labeled this as the shift total. So it wasn't this person who contributed this much. We're just using her as sort of the placeholder for that to record that information. So this is just a way to keep track of other numerical metrics, on the event itself. We do have a webinar on impact tracking entirely, but it's always nice to point out those kinds of features just to make sure you're aware those things exist. And of course, those can be used with time slot events as well. There's one more feature I want to mention, not unique to time slot events, that is something that you might find interesting if you haven't seen it before, and that's custom registration questions. Those can be used to capture additional information when someone is signing up for an event. So for example, I actually have a time slot event called Meals for Families. It's kind of like a potluck type event where volunteers are signing up to bring food to a family. And when they do so, they are actually requested to identify what type of dish they're bringing and what's the name of the dish. That way, volunteers can kind of coordinate with one another by looking at the people who registered ahead of them and what they said they're bringing. So those custom registration questions are going to be visible when you're looking at the list of registered volunteers, kind of in the same manner as the impact tracking metrics. But you can see the person's responses to those questions. And like I said, for this event in my system, I have that data publicly posted so volunteers can see who's signed up ahead of them and what they said they're bringing. Okay, there's one more feature. I know I said that already, but this is the last feature I want to walk through, and that's the option to add an extra column of info to your registration page. So when you're looking at the list of attendees for an event, you might be constantly trying to reference some piece of information. Maybe you need their t-shirt size in there. Maybe you just want their emergency contact on hand. Maybe you want to know what groups they're a part of or what tags they have on their profile. You can add an extra column to this page now. This is true for every type of opportunity. It's not just for time slot events. But when we are editing an event or creating a new event, if we go into update or edit event opportunity, there's a section in here called additional organizer options. And there's a new item in here called include the following information in the registration listing for this opportunity. Basically, this is just asking you, do you want extra info on that page? This is only visible on the back end. Your volunteers aren't going to be engaging this information because it's just when you're looking at that listing. But if we select something in here, again, you can choose between different information that you're tracking, including things like custom fields or attributes on the volunteer's profile. But a common one I see used through here is t-shirt size, so you can quickly reference that information. If we turn that column on, go ahead and update the event. Now, if we go and look at that same page we were just looking at for viewing the registered volunteers, you can see there's an extra column in here, and we can see that item just right next to each person's name. Now, of course, you can always go in and just pop up view profile details from here as well if you need to view their full account information. But if there's some piece of information that you're consistently referencing on a specific event, it's sometimes nice to just include that in line here. All right. Well, we've gone through quite a bit of information here regarding time slot events. So that about rounds out basically what we're going to go through today. We talked about utilizing time slot events, the differences between the different types of time slot events. But I want to just call back to, if you have any questions about this topic or any other topic really in the system, you can always engage with our customer support team. When you're logged in as an admin, click on the Need Help button down at the bottom of the page. You can type in a question or topic through here. We have a lot of articles, so if you like to learn that way, this is a great resource. But no matter what you search for, you can always click Contact Us to submit a ticket to our customer support team, and they'll get back to you right away. They are excellent. I also want to mention, again, that we have our past recorded webinars on YouTube. If you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you there. You can also just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies, but all of our past recorded webinars are up here. We have a bunch of different kind of playlists and things like that organized as well. So that brings us to the end of our time here today. I want to thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to speak with you all. We're grateful for the opportunity to labor alongside you as you and your volunteers serve your different communities. So thank you for all of the work that you do and for inviting us to be a part of that. I look forward to our next meeting, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.